sorry, what?
We cannot keep recording faster.
Yes. Just in case this doesn't work or I forget to push a button or
Alright, that's fine.
something. Which tends to happen.
Yeah.
Too many things. All right. Okay. Okay. What you guys do this weekend? Anything fun?
I had a date.
You had what?
A date.
A date? How do you date in the age of COVID?
Oh, wear masks.
I gotta click record. Okay. So you wear a mask, that's how you date it?
Yeah, well, whenever you go to a restaurant, you can take the mask off and sit down.
Right. I did see an article, I didn't read it, I just saw the headline, that said the CDC says that eating in a restaurant is probably the most dangerous thing we're doing right now.
I saw that too.
So,
I love being.
we do go out some. Most of the time, if there's outside seating, we sit outside. When they went down to 25% for a couple weeks, what I thought was really funny was a couple of the restaurants just blocked off half their seating. Instead of like spreading everybody out, they cut off half their seating and then used every other table. And it's like that kind of defeats the whole purpose of 25%. The whole point is supposed to have a table and then 3 empty and then a table and then 3 empty. And so it's really hard, and it's not good for the restaurant owners. It's amazing how many are going to go out of business. It's sad. I mean, there's no easy answers, folks. Crossing our fingers for the vaccine. I have not taken attendance. I need to do that. Hold on just a second. I'll be here on that side. Okay, and anybody else not here that I'm missing? Is Madeline here? Okay. All right. Back to the screen sharing. Where's my screen sharing? All right. Okay, so I have graded the exams. I'm not handing them back yet because you have a couple classmates that haven't taken it because they were on quarantine or whatever. So probably hand them back maybe tomorrow. I can't hear you.
We get to keep the exams.
No. No. But you can make an appointment to come in and see me, and then I can let you look at them. Okay. But I have posted grades on the exam. They were significantly better than the last exam. Chapters 11 and 12, I posted videos for, so do those assignments. That material will, if it shows up on the next exam, it'll just be a question or two. It's not going to be a major part of the next exam, but there are assignments within those videos that you need to complete. Okay. Yes?
So this is 13.
So this is chapter 13 that we're starting today. So, chapter 13, I forget what the title is, How Populations Evolve or something. So yes, we're going to talk about the E word, and we're going to talk about Charles Darwin, but you do not have to check your faith at the door. Okay? So just hang with me. If you find this difficult, remember that knowledge is power. And it's better to know than to not know, regardless of your position. So we're first going to look at some of the historical background as to where the theory of natural selection and the principle of evolution came from. The first known even mention in scientific writing, in any kind of writings that we have hold of, is a guy by the name of Anaximander. Has anybody heard of Anaximander? Usually the only people who have heard of Anaximander are philosophy majors, okay? It's kind of because he didn't win the argument, okay? But he was a philosopher, and he thought life arose from water and that simpler forms of life preceded more complex ones. Then came along Aristotle. How many of you have heard of Aristotle? Okay, we've all heard of Aristotle. He kind of won, okay? So history rewards the people who become famous. Okay? So he held the belief that species are fixed and do not evolve. And he developed something called the Great Chain of Being, which was accepted over any previous ideas that had been around there. And that simply said that there were lower forms of life, then things got more complex, and then there were humans, and then things got more complex, and then there were spiritual beings. So that all the way from the lowest forms of life that they knew at that time, through humans, all the way up through the gods, there was a chain of being. Okay. The Judeo-Christian culture fortified this idea because, remember, the Greeks were not particularly Judeo-Christian. They were Christian at this time because we're talking about BC. But they were not Jewish either. And but the Judeo-Christian culture kind of absconded with this idea and grabbed hold of it, and at one point suggested that the earth is only about 6,000 years old. Now, in reality, that did not become a popular thought until about 100 years ago. In previous times, there was no particular thought that the world was only 6,000 years old. That is a recent addition to the more fundamentalist Christian philosophy. The basic idea of the Great Chain of Being is that all species were created in one giant creation event. There was an event, everything was created, boom, okay? And that everything that was ever created still is, because the Creator would not allow anything that was created to be lost, because that would diminish the Creator. Okay? So that was the thinking of the time. But then there came some problems with this philosophy, and that happened starting about the late 1400s, early 1500s. First of all, there were explorers that found exotic organisms that were unique to isolated places. Think the most isolated place with the weirdest organisms. What can you think of?
The bottom of the ocean.
Bottom of the ocean. Well, we didn't get there yet. If we're thinking historically. You're right, but that's a relatively recent. What would have happened more back in the 15, 1600s?
Like the Amazon?
The where?
Amazon? Amazon?
Amazon, maybe, yeah. Where else? Madagascar, where else? What's close to, I think, geography was not my strong suit. What continent is close to Madagascar? If I'm thinking right. What? Oh, okay. Well, I'm wrong.
New Zealand?
And what's next to New Zealand? Australia. Okay, that's where I was thinking. That's where I was trying to go. I don't know where Madagascar is. I'm sorry, I got a D in geography. And I'm a successful person, so you can recover from a D, trust me. But Australia, what's unique about Australia?
The elephant? It's an island?
What do they have?
Kangaroo.
They have kangaroos. They have all these marsupials. Think about exotic organisms. Weird, weird, weird stuff. They have venomous snakes that are the most venomous anywhere in the world. Australia is weird, okay? In terms of biogeography, okay? And then they also, though, found similar species that were separated by vast distances. So you have this kind of conundrum because you have this place that has totally stuff that there's nothing even similar to anywhere else. And then you have, on the other hand, you have things that are close to each other that are separated by oceans or mountains or something. So this was a bit confusing. Then those that were observing nature were actually overwhelmed at one point when they started doing some categorizing things, and they were looking at the whole species concept, and all of a sudden they became very overwhelmed by the number of different species. And there is a poem written by Thomas Moffat, who will come across again in 1590. To me, this is not great poetry, but I'm not a literature person. Some green, some black, some blue, some fly with one pair of wings, others with more. Those that have no wings leap. Those that cannot fly or leap, they walk. Some have long shanks, some shorter. Some there are that sing, others are silent. What's he talking about? Grasshoppers. Basically, grasshoppers. Locusts. Okay? So they were starting to get into this whole concept that there were all these different variations on a theme kind of thing. Okay? Then along came the anatomists, who were studying the diverse species. And this happened at this point in time in terms of historic, because before this point in time it was considered sinful, basically, to cut open things, particularly people, either before or after they were dead. So if you're not looking inside organisms, you're not going to see similarities that happen inside organisms that are not visible from the outside. Now, who is the big exception to this about cutting open humans and doing stuff? Surgeons. Well, this is before there were really much surgeons. What culture made a habit of opening up people after they were dead? The Egyptians, the mummies. When they mummified bodies, they took out some of their internal organs and mummified them kind of separately. But for the most part, they didn't cut open stuff before the 1500s, 1500s. And what they found when they started opening things and people up was that there were parts with no known function. For example, many snakes have a pelvic girdle and hind leg bones. You don't see them, but they're there. The humans have an appendix and a tailbone. Anybody had to have their appendix out? It doesn't serve us well in this day and time. The appendix does not help us. And neither does the tailbone. Really, it probably has a function, but mostly it just serves to be a pain if you break it. Problematic. And then there's geology. the fossil layers start revealing a progression from simpler to more complex organisms in different layers of rock, things that were extinct. So this all throws a wrench into the whole great chain of being thought. So there were some new ideas that were explored. One of these was put forward by Jorge Cuvier in 1769. Now, you will notice that most of these scientists are not Americans, right? Most of them are British or French or German or something else. Why is that? Look at this time frame.
America wasn't a thing yet.
America really wasn't a thing. I mean, we didn't even become a country until 1776. And then we were fighting what war? What war started in 1776?
Revolution.
The Revolutionary War started in 1776. And then it lasted a few years, and then we got a constitution. And then what happened in 1812? The War of 1812. And then what happened in the later 1800s, the 1860s? The Civil War. And then it wasn't until then that we were even much of anything. We were doing Manifest Destiny, and we were doing a whole lot of things that were not science, okay? So until you get all the way up to World War I and World War II, we were not a world power. We were not an important country. We were big, but we were not important, okay? So, and we certainly weren't doing science in large amounts. So Jorge Cuvier, I think that's how you pronounce it, was an anatomist that was among the first to accept that extinction had actually occurred. And he observed these abrupt changes in the fossil record. And now that's one thing the United States was good for. We got lots of fossils. The United States is a very rich place for fossils. And so he espoused the theory or hypothesis of catastrophism. And catastrophism is pretty much like it sounds. He basically said there was one great creation, and then over vast periods of time, there were individual catastrophes that were perhaps worldwide, and that those catastrophes had wiped out a certain part of the population and wiped out entire species, and that there was no evolution, there was no change in species over time, but that everything that exists now was created in the initial creation, but that some things had gone extinct in the meantime. So think a big flood, okay? That's where he was getting his ideas. So then after the catastrophe, whatever's left would repopulate the world, and we would move on from there, okay? And his thought was there was no evolution, we just hadn't found all the fossils yet. Then along comes the idea of evolutionary adaptations. In the mid-1700s, there was more and more evidence of fossils, and things started looking older and older. And then comes along a guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And I think I actually have the wrong, let me stop this for a second. I think I have the wrong, yeah, this is the one for Canvas. Hold on just a minute. Hold up the wrong. Back to Zoom. Share screen. Same basic information, just organized a little differently. I've tried to, on the Canvas, I try to put more than one, I try to condense the slides, so there's not as many slides on there. Okay, so Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested that organisms inheritance of acquired characteristics. What that means is that if your parents accomplish something, your biological parents accomplish something, then that is passed on to you genetically. Okay? That's what the inheritance of acquired characteristics means. Now today we would poo-poo that and say, well, that's ridiculous. But you have to go by what was the thinking at the time, and that was consistent with the thinking at the time. For example, I have a friend who fell off a cliff, broke her ankle, had to have many surgeries on her ankle. Fast forward to many years later, she has a little girl who's born with a hip dysplasia and has to be in a body cast for the first year of her life. Then she has a second little girl who's born with a club foot. So she has two children born with orthopedic problems, and she fell off a cliff and destroyed her ankle when she was 23 or 24. Did her children have orthopedic problems because she fell off the cliff? No. But if you didn't know anything about inheritance, you didn't know anything about genes, you didn't know anything about chromosomes and DNA and all that kind of stuff, it would not be that far-fetched of an idea. Okay? So that's an example of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's where that comes from, that kind of thing. And the classic example is giraffes. Let's say giraffes' ancestors were striving to reach the top of the tree. And the ones that stretched their necks the farthest passed that on to their offspring. Well, that's not what happened. What happened was the organisms that had the longer necks could reach the higher parts of the tree. More of them survived. They passed on the length of their neck to their offspring, and their offspring had longer necks. So over a period of time, you get giraffes with longer necks. That's a different explanation and is consistent with the evidence that we have. Okay. So prevailing beliefs influence how we interpret things. But the theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics depends on this concept that life gradually improves. And then along comes a young man named Charles Darwin. Darwin in 1831 left Great Britain on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He was a med school dropout. He was the son of a preacher. He was a gentleman. Remember, at this time in British society, there was still kind of a class system. You were kind of either a worker or a gentleman or a royal or something like that, okay? And there were not that many professions that a gentleman could do. A gentleman could be a doctor or a lawyer or a business owner or a pastor or, there were a few things they could be, but there weren't a huge number of choices. You didn't go down and work at the local factory in 1831, okay? And so he went to med school and dropped out. Then he went to seminary, never intending to be a pastor, but it was kind of one of those things you kind of do. And he was basically looking to find himself, and he went on a short mapping trip to Wales, because that was something that people did. This was still, they're exploring, and so he went on this trip. He probably knew geography really well, not like me, okay, he was good at that. So then he was offered a position as the naturalist and gentleman's companion to the captain of the Beagle. Now, his passion was nature. He loved observing nature, but that did not turn in, that was not a profession per se at that point in time. But being a gentleman's companion was a thing, because the captain in a ship wasn't supposed to be hanging out with the men that slop the deck or whatever. I don't know what you do on a ship, but anyway, there was a class system, okay? And so he was going to be the gentleman's companion. His father did not like this, was not in appropriate, he didn't feel like, thing for Charles to do, but his uncle eventually convinced his father to let him do it. So there was this 2-year voyage that ended up taking 5 years, and the point of it was to map the southern coast of South America. The ship probably looked more like this than what you might think, and living on a ship like that for 5 years is beyond my imagination. I went on a little whale watching trip on a ship in San Diego, and for 3 hours, and I thought I was going to die. I got seasick so badly, it was awful. But it didn't look that much different than this ship. So here's the trip he took. So he started off right after Christmas in 1831 from Great Britain. They traveled down to the eastern part of South America, and they got there in April, so it took them about 3.5 months. And then they started a slow journey around South America, mapping all the way. And so they would make stops, and they would go on shore, and they would do whatever you do when you're mapping a continent. And then they were coming back, and they made a fateful stop in the Galapagos, and this was in September of 1833. So this is 2 years, almost 2 years after 4 years after the original journey started. And then after they left the Galapagos, they came back through Australia, down below Africa, and then back up to England. So it took them about 5 years to do this. So they spent about 3.5 years actually mapping South America. So on this journey, he collected thousands of specimens that he either sent or took back, because they did meet other ships on the way, and so he could send stuff back to England. He took very careful notes. He observed the adaptations in different organisms, and he also read a book. I think he had read it once before, but he kind of read it again. It was called Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And that suggested that the Earth had changed gradually over long periods of time, which was not consistent with the 6,000-year thing. But that 6,000-year thing really wasn't a big deal in the 1800s. People didn't really worry about that. But he set out the theory of what's called uniformitarianism. Say that 3 times. Uniformitarianism. Okay? And so Darwin was intrigued by, so he's got all these things running around in his 20-something-year-old head. And he looks at they get to the Galapagos, and he looks at what's there. And it's interesting because the Galapagos organisms resemble the ones in South America more closely than the ones on nearby islands. So the Galapagos are a series of islands, kind of like Hawaii, that are west of South America. They are owned by Ecuador, and there's a bunch of little islands. And what he found was that the organisms he found on the Galapagos were more similar to organisms on the mainland than they were to organisms on the next island over. That was really confusing, really unusual. And particularly he looked at finches, which are little birds. Okay? He saw exotic species he had never seen before. He found marine fossils in the mountains. What does marine mean? Ocean or salt water. So he was finding marine fossils up in the mountains, which didn't make sense. And he also found some fossils that were similar but distinctly different than living specimens. And one example of this was the armadillo. Anybody seen an armadillo? Okay. And something called the glyptodont, which is like a huge armadillo. He found a fossil of this glyptodont, which is a huge armadillo. He found marine iguanas, something that hadn't been seen before. These iguanas actually dive in the water and eat the algae and stuff off rocks, as opposed to iguanas on the mainland. What do iguanas eat? They're big lizards. Okay, my very first room, I lived at home my first quarter in college, and my parents got transferred to St. Louis. So I was moving on campus and talked to my soon-to-be roommate on the phone, and she told me she had 2 iguanas and a dog living in her room. I never could figure out what she had on the house. I figured she must have something on the housing director to be allowed to do that, because that was not allowed. Turned out she also had a live-in boyfriend, but I never spent the night there. But I went to meet her, and she said iguanas, but I was thinking like a gecko or a chameleon. That's what was in my head. And I went, and she had these iguanas that were like 4 or 5 feet long, and they were loose in the room. I mean, she had a cage, but most of the time they were just loose in the room. It was, I was like, there's no way I'm spending the night in this room. So I stayed. Somebody else that didn't have a roommate let me stay in their room. But anyway, it was pretty bad. But iguanas eat bugs and they'll eat vegetation. But these actually go in the water and eat the moss and the algae off rocks and stuff. So totally different species of iguanas. Darwin was also influenced by he was a big reader, by the writings of Charles Lyell. Remember Lyell? Okay. And he was influenced by the writings of Thomas Malthus. Remember, he's the one that wrote that not great poem. Okay. But Thomas Malthus turns out to have been a clergyman and an economist who wrote a work called An Essay on the Principles of Population. And his premise as a mathematician was that he was worried about humans and economy and that kind of stuff. And he said the population of humans had the tendency to increase geometrically, what we might call exponentially. 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16, becomes 20, 32. But the food supply tends to increase arithmetically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So what does that result in? What?
A shortage of food.
A shortage. That then leads to competition. So his basic premise was that competition for food, space, water, the resources that we need, in turn leads to disease, famine, and wars. Okay? So all this stuff is running around in Charles's head. Okay? He's thinking about all these things. And so he comes up with 2 main points in his work called On the Origin of Species. First of all, he said that organisms inhabiting the earth today descended from ancestral species. Now, people, remember I told you my mom got really upset when my brother came home and said brown eyes were dominant? People have trouble with words sometimes. What does the word descent mean? That means several things. What are some definitions of the word descent?
To fall.
What?
To fall or to come
To
down.
fall or to come down. We talk about a descent into hell sometimes if you're a religious person or something, or a descent into sin. What else does it mean? What if I said descendant?
Kind of like the ancestor you like pass down.
Yeah, what you pass down from parent to child, biological parent to biological child, right? You are a descendant of your biological parents, your biological grandparents, your biological great-grandparents, and that's what it means here. It doesn't mean descend as in become less good or something like that. It means descend as in descendant, okay, with modification. So what Darwin said is that the organisms inhabiting the earth today descended from ancestral species, and that natural selection was the mechanism for this descent with modification. Basically, the first statement is kind of saying evolution happens, which from a biological perspective is not even a theory anymore. It is a principle. We can see evolution. We can observe it. Natural selection is a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It is a theory. That means it's well accepted. It is still subject to modification, but it is generally accepted. Okay? There are other mechanisms of evolution that we'll talk about, but natural selection is one of the primary ones. Okay. Now, before you get all hyper, some people get real hyper about this, let's look at what natural selection actually says, not what somebody else might have told you. All right, what you're going to need to know for the next exam. When I tell you you have to know something for the exam, do I put it on the exam? Okay? I'm telling you you have to know this for the exam. There are 3 observations and there are 3 inferences that make up the theory of natural selection. You should be able to list those and understand what those mean. Okay? 3 observations, 3 inferences. Observation number 1 is overpopulation. And that comes from the Thomas Malthus concept of humans. Okay? All species tend to produce excessive numbers. Think of plants. Every single seed is a new plant. Okay? Think of starfish. They make thousands of offspring. So when we say excessive numbers, that means more than what it takes to replace themselves. Okay? That's an observation, that's a fact. Okay? Inference number 1 from that fact, or from that observation, is that competition exists. Because there are too many organisms, there's a struggle for existence, competition for available resources. So observation number 1 is overproduction. Inference number 1 is competition. Okay. Now, this bothers some people. It doesn't go observation, inference, observation, inference, observation, inference. It goes observation, inference, observation, observation, inference, inference. Okay, so just relax. Okay, observation number 2 is individual variation. This is a critical factor, and this is what many people don't get. Variation exists among individuals in a population in form, function, and behavior. And much of this is heritable. When we say form, we're talking about anatomy. Is everybody in this class the same height? No. And we're a relatively homogeneous group, okay? Not completely, but relatively. But we're still not all the same height. Do we all have the same hair color, eye color? Do we make the same amount of insulin? Do we make the same amount of, I don't know, other kinds of hormones? We don't. There are variances within our population. And those are pre-existent in the population. Evolution did not create those changes. They just happen basically by mutation. So that's form. Function would be physiology. Physiology, how fast do your muscle fibers contract? How fast do you digest your food? Things like that is physiology. How does your brain send out neurotransmitters across the synapses, stuff like that. That's physiology. And behavior. If there's a bad guy coming into a building, what do?
Fight or flight.
Fight or flight, or one other thing. Hide. I hide. I know I'm not going to outrun them. I know I'm not going to outfight them, but I would hide, okay? But one of the things that bugs, we watch a lot of action TV shows and dramas and movies. Well, we used to go to the movies a lot, but always annoyed me is in these movies, especially when the bad guy comes in the building, everybody runs to the roof. All right, where are you gonna go if you're on the roof? Unless you're Superman, you're not gonna be that good at jumping from the roof of one building to the roof of the next building. I say run down so you can get away, okay? But anyway, different behaviors. Hopefully you saw some different behaviors in your squirrels. By the way, your squirrel data, you need to get to me or your lab professor by Tuesday, that's tomorrow, so that we can compile it so that in lab on Wednesday, we can help you go through the statistics. Okay, so you might want to bring your computers to lab on Wednesday. All right, so make sure you've done your squirrel observations, get it in to whoever your group, pick a group person to then send it to your lab professor. But you've probably seen some differences in your squirrels, hopefully. Some run out faster, some wait till you get closer. That's behavior, okay? And much of this is heritable. So that's observation number 2, is that there's individual variation in a population. Observation number 3 is adaptation. Some forms of heritable traits are more adaptive than others in competing for resources, but that depends on the circumstances. So running faster, better camouflage, less body odor, that'd be physiology. Those kinds of things can make a difference. All right, in this room right now, how many of you are cool or cold? Okay? In this room right now, how many of you are feeling hot? Okay? Is one better than the other? No. Okay? But what if there was a sudden change in the Earth's temperature and all of a sudden the average temperature on Earth went down 20 degrees? Who would have the advantage? The people who feel cold right now or the people who feel hot right now? People who feel hot, right? They would have the advantage. But think of it the other way. What if the Earth suddenly became 20 degrees warmer? Who would have the advantage? The people who are cold right now. So it's not that one is better than the other. It depends on the circumstances. Okay? So adaptation is always dependent on the local circumstances. Okay? Inference number 2, survivability. Because adaptive traits promote survival and reproduction, they must increase in frequency over the generations, and less adaptive traits must decrease in frequency or disappear. What that means is, whatever helps promote survival and reproduction is going to increase in the population, and whatever does not promote survivability and reproduction is going to decrease in frequency in the population. And some of those things may not be super obvious. They ask, I think it was Margaret Mead. Do you guys know who Margaret Mead is? Very famous anthropologist, studied fossils and humans and apes and all kinds of things. And I think it was her that they asked, what event really showed, in fossil history, what event shows the kind of the ascendance of humans? Humans as like separated from apes. And the expectation was standing upright or, you know, having a particular bone structure or something like that. And you know what the answer was? A healed, broken leg. In the natural world, what happens if an animal breaks its leg? A bad break in the leg. It's going to die. Is that bone going to heal? No. So when humans became human, they cared for their ill, basically. so the bone had an opportunity to heal. They were brought food, because it takes a while for human bones to heal, right? And we're talking like a bad break in a major bone that you couldn't walk, okay? So they had to be cared for, they had to be brought food, they had to be brought water, all that kind of stuff, okay? So that was really the key. So an adaptive trait would be behavioral that way in caring for each other, okay? So it can be seen in both very anatomical things and then also clearly in behavioral things, okay? There are frogs in the Midwest, upper Midwest somewhere, I don't remember where now, and that have 5 legs, and you find them all over the place. There's a mutation that happened, and kids were the ones that found it, like middle school age kids. And it's one of those things, if that 5th leg helps the frogs, it will persist in the population. If that 5th leg is a detriment to the frogs, if it weighs it down without helping, then it'll disappear in the population. So whatever is helpful will increase, and what's not helpful will decrease, okay? And then inference number 3 is basically the definition of natural selection. Differential reproductive success. Formally, the traits characterizing the population change over time when its individuals differ in one or more heritable traits that are responsible for differences in survivability and reproducibility. In other words, those individuals with traits best suited for the local environment lead more fertile offspring. He who has the most grandchildren wins in evolutionary terms. Because your offspring, you not only have to have offspring, biological offspring, your offspring have to have offspring. So changes, the traits can change over time when the individuals differ in one or more heritable traits. That means things that can be inherited, that are responsible for differences in survivability and reproducibility. Question? So 3 observations, 3 inferences. So let's look at the evidences for this. So we're going to go back to some of the things we touched on earlier in the chapter. So we have some fossils. Fossils are simply preserved remnants or impressions left by organisms that lived in the past. It doesn't have to be a bone, although those are probably the most common. Footprints can be fossils. Leaf impressions can be fossils. Why don't we have a lot of fossils that we find in the ocean? We find a lot of fossils in the ocean. Yeah, first of all, the water helps break stuff down so you don't have as much material that would be there to leave an impression. We do get shells, sand, you know, it's just really hard. Plus, think about, what about a jellyfish? Are you going to get a fossil of a jellyfish? Probably not, because the body's too soft. So a lot of things in the ocean are too soft to leave any kind of fossil. So not everything leaves a fossil. We usually find fossils in sedimentary rock. Remember, geology was not much. No, I told you I got a D in geography. I actually got an F in geology. Geography and got a D in geology in 7th grade. It was not a good year. But most fossils are found in sedimentary rock. Now, there's sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock. So most fossils are found in sedimentary rock. And in general, they appear in layers from newest to oldest as you go deep. Now, not 100% of the time, because earthquakes and stuff, you know, sometimes kind of mess things up. But geologists can tell when that's happened, when pieces have been, there's been an upheaval and changed things around. But in general, fossils form as sand or other materials kind of fall on top of dead stuff, and you get layers then where they have different fossils. And because frequently there have been catastrophic events, you see changes in the color. If you drive along any interstate or major road, you see rock walls on the side, and you can see color changes in the rock. And that's due to whatever the environmental conditions were at that point when that rock was laid down. Now, there are also fossils, amber. Anybody fan of Jurassic Park? That's how they got the dinosaur DNA, was from amber, which is just a critter that gets encased in sap, basically, and then it hardens and turns into what we call amber. So the fossil record is generally an ordered sequence, and it fits with the other evidence of evolution. A paleontologist is a scientist that studies fossils and stuff. And people often ask, where are the transitional forms? Well, every time you find it, we have found a lot of transitional forms. Every time you find a transitional form, you open up two more places. You got A and B, and you find one in the middle, now you got two gaps. So every time you fill in a gap, you make two more gaps. And it's just a picture of rock. You may have been to the Rocky Mountains. We went a couple of years ago. Pretty spectacular. I got tired of it after a while, though. I was like, it's just rock. I mean, they call them Rocky Mountains for a reason. Like some of the Appalachians where there's trees and stuff. Okay, and in these fossils, they found interesting structures. They found in the flippers of ancient fish and whales and stuff, they found like the bones for hind limbs. Okay, going back to biogeography, which is the study of the geographic distribution of species, remember that that's what first brought Darwin's mind that today's organisms evolved from ancestral forms. And there's lots of evidence today. The most obvious, again, is Australia. What is the only marsupial that is native to North and South America? It is not a well-respected species. Possums. Possums are marsupials. And then the comparative anatomy, we go back and look at body structures. And it turns out that there is this thing called homology. What does homo mean? Same. Homology means that there is similarity in structures due to common ancestry. And we see that, for example, in, these are 4 different types of mammals. And you'll notice that they all have the same basic bone structure. There's a humerus, a radius, an ulna. There are wrist bones that we call carpals. There are hand bones that we call metacarpals. And then there are finger bones that we call phalanges. They're arranged differently because each one of these serves a different function. Human hands have the ability to do very fine functions, okay? Cats walk on their forelimbs. Whales, of course, have to swim, their fins, and bats obviously fly. So, but the same basic bone structure is found in each one, even though from the outside they look very different. Then we were able to start doing embryology. Embryology is looking at embryos of different organisms. And it turns out that comparative embryology, especially vertebrates, supports evolutionary theory. And when you take Bio 214, which organismal biology, you will learn a lot more about this, but they used to classify organisms primarily on what they look like. Now, they use embryology, how they develop, and of course the next thing we're going to look at is molecular biology. Now we can look at DNA and proteins and stuff, and now they are changing. It's one of the areas of biology that's actually changing is how we assign, not how we assign things to phyla, but what things have in common to a certain extent, and that's why protists are going to blow up. Okay? So the hypothesis was that alterations in early embryonic life are likely to cause death, so vertebrate embryos are remarkably similar. There are these things called Hox genes that determine early growth in embryos. And when you mess with those, it's usually fatal. The embryo then does not survive. And because any change in those very, very early embryonic stages, any change is generally fatal, they're very similar among organisms that share a common ancestry. So for example, the embryos of fish, reptiles, birds, and humans, which is kind of, they didn't put amphibians in here, but we kind of go fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, humans is kind of the general categories of vertebrates that we talk about. We see that there are a lot of similarities. For example, all vertebrate embryos at some stage have gills. You had gills. They became your, I think, vocal cord, forget now. You had a tail, what we call a post-anal tail, a tail that went past your anus. It kind of receded over time, and all that's left is your tailbone. You had a notochord and a dorsal nerve cord. The dorsal nerve cord became your spinal cord. The notochord becomes your vertebrae. Okay. So all of these, they don't look identical, but they're very, very similar. Somebody who's an embryologist can tell them apart. If you just threw one at me, I probably couldn't. It's not my area. If you are interested in this kind of stuff, developmental biology is a really good course that Dr. Livingston teaches every other spring. So you can take that either your junior or senior year. Really good course. And then we move into molecular biology, because now we can measure DNA and proteins relatively easily and cheaply. I'm not going to say it doesn't cost anything, but it's not horribly expensive to look at molecular biology. And so they are using molecular biology now to put things in categories and to study evolution as well. For example, if you look at a chimpanzee and you look at how similar the DNA of other species is to chimpanzees, you find that humans are like 98% the same DNA as chimpanzees. Gorillas are 97% the same as chimpanzees. So humans are actually more closely related to chimpanzees than gorillas are. Now, does that mean chimpanzees and humans are the same thing? No, that 2% is obviously pretty important. But it does show how similar. We are similar enough to chimpanzees that we can do blood transfusions between chimpanzees and humans. There has been a lot of research into doing transplants. In fact, they did transplant, do we have baboons up here? No. They did transplant one time a baboon heart into an infant, because there are not many infant hearts available for transplant. So they were trying to see if you could do a trans species. Child did not live super long. I don't know what the status of that is, but Galapagos Islands, I told you, are very similar to Hawaii. They're volcanic islands. And that means there was volcanoes under the ocean, and slowly and slowly and slowly, eventually over time, it poked through the ocean, and then you have land masses. Okay, so all you've got is rock. And eventually, you get some life forms on these islands because birds fly over and drop poop, and that has seeds in it maybe, and so you get a little bit of different plant kinds of growth. And usually start out with lichen is the first thing that grows, and then there's other stuff that grows, and eventually, over vast periods of time, you get animals that come, and whatever happened to grow on that island then would be the food source for the birds. While on the mainland, there's lots of food sources. If you're thinking of little birds like finches, what do you think of birds as eating? Birds eat seeds, they eat worms, they eat insects, they eat nectar, some of them eat nectar, some of them eat flowers, some of them eat berries. So there's lots of different food sources for birds on the mainland. But when you go to an island, a relatively new island in geographic time, you may only have one food source. And if one island has only seeds as a food source, and another island has only insects as a feed source, the kind of birds that are going to survive on those two islands and live to reproduce are going to be different than each other. They may be vastly different than each other. Whereas on the mainland, any bird with any beak can survive. So that's kind of where you see these differences. So you need really strong beaks to eat seeds. You need long, thin beaks to drink nectar. And you need a strong, pointy beak to get insects in a tree trunk, kind of like a woodpecker would do. Okay? So, yeah, on the mainland you would find all those, but on the island you would probably only find one. And the next island over might have a different food source. So you end up with birds that have distinctly strong short beaks and birds that have long thin beaks. And eventually, again, over long periods of time, then they won't interbreed anymore. And once they won't interbreed, then you have a new species. So here are some examples. This is a ground finch, a tree finch, and a woodpecker finch. This one's actually using tools. It's pretty cool. Other adaptations include color. You guys like praying mantises, praying manti? There are mantids all over the world. In this particular, in Trinidad, there's a tree mantid that mimics dead leaves. And there's a flower mantid in Malaysia. This one is hard for people to even find in the picture. It's so well camouflaged. But if you look really closely, see, I have to stop and think where it is. Here's the eyes right here. And then a leaf mantid in Costa Rica. Got a really round head portion. So they're adapted for their local environment. We see natural selection. It occurs, we can observe it. We've seen it in pesticide resistance in insects. If just a very few insects are resistant to a particular pesticide, then they can survive and reproduce, and their offspring are more likely to be resistant to that pesticide. We've seen it a lot in the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Overuse of antibiotics has helped create that. There are drug-resistant strains of HIV now. There's also artificial selection. Breeds of dogs. A Chihuahua and a Great Dane are the same species. In theory, they can interbreed. Probably not a good idea, but it can be done. What breeds of dogs dogs are the longest lived? Pedigree dogs or mutts? Mutts, why?
They have like adaptations from two different dogs.
They have adaptations from different species that help them survive. If you buy a dog that's a purebred something or other, you're automatically probably limiting its lifespan. So realize that. They live longer. Interestingly, the larger the dog, typically the shorter its lifespan. Little dogs seem to live much longer than big dogs. Flowers, and I think I told you recently, we've been, when you talk about genetically modified food and stuff like that, we've been genetically modifying plants since people have been farming, basically. But we get flowers the colors we want, we get corn that's sweeter, we get green beans without strings, we do all kinds of stuff. And we're working on making bacteria that can actually do bioremediation in the sense of when you have an oil spill and you got to clean it up, you vacuum, basically you vacuum as much of it as you can. And then if you had bacteria that would eat the oil and not create a worse byproduct, you could then consume all the oil that way and protect your habitat. Working on that. So, the modern synthesis, remember I told you Darwin and Mendel were born the same year, never knew about each other's work. But now we kind of merge these together into a synthesis. And understanding it requires an appreciation of populations as the unit of evolution. There's a couple of really key points here. Individuals do not evolve. Now, we're talking about in terms of biology. We're talking in terms of broad things. We all evolve in the sense that our ideas and our perceptions and things like that change over time, okay? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about true evolution of biology, because you can't change your genetics. You have what you inherited. But you have to think of populations. Populations are groups of individuals of the same species that can interbreed. That's our basic definition. So you have to think in terms of populations when you're talking in terms of evolution. Okay? So one of the common errors is trying to apply the principles to individuals. You can't apply the principles to individuals. It doesn't work. So you have to look over generations. Okay? So I think we'll stop there. Shouldn't have shaken anybody's faith. Never said